Welcome to the Drill Down, in-depth answers to oilfield questions. I'm John Spears.
And I'm Richard Spears.
So Richard, I thought that this week we would take a couple of items from the news, from the recent news, and see how they relate to each other. Okay?
You mean the 2 million vaccines that we've...
Yeah, well, there's a lot of items. What I particularly had in mind starting off with was the announcements last week that came out of the OPEC Plus meetings, that group would begin to step up production, reduce the amount of oil they've been holding off the market, right?
Now, and when you hear news like that, you begin to think one of your reactions could be, hey, is OPEC actually getting ahead of itself?
Right. Yes, and that's a very good point because, but it would appear that in making that decision, they've been paying close attention to what's happening in terms of global demand and where they now think it's going to be over the next 3 months. And so they're not trying to get ahead of those demand growth figures. They're trying to match what's out there in the marketplace. And I think that's all because right now, anyway, that group is mostly concerned about holding prices steady. They don't want to see prices go down. So they're being very cautious about how quickly they reintroduce oil to the marketplace. So the decision was made, and this was OPEC as a group plus Saudi Arabia, who on its own has been voluntarily holding 1 million barrels a day off the market and its own production cutback. And so between the two, we're going to see 600,000 barrels more come into the market in May and another 700,000 barrels in June, and then on top of that, another 850,000 barrels a day come July. So all told, net growth in production, a little over 2 million barrels a day, over the next 3 months.
And that gets us back up to how close to the old time 102 million barrels a day of consumption.
Yeah, so by July, the world is projected to be consuming about 98 plus million barrels a day. And interestingly enough, over that May, June, July period, the projections are that demand will grow about 2 million barrels a day. So what we see here happening is OPEC Plus matching that expected growth in the marketplace. So the thought I had is, okay, and so after that 2 million barrels a day comes back into the market, this will now leave OPEC Plus with about 6 million barrels a day still in reserve that it's got, back behind the pipe.
Okay,
that it could bring into the market.
So we're sitting here in U.S. land physically.
Yes.
And so we're observing the behavior of U.S. oil producers.
Yes.
And they are not raising their oil output.
No, they're lifting drilling activity and frac activity, but the net effect is at best holding U.S. production flat.
And that's at best.
At best, yeah.
So any demand growth around the world is not going to be satisfied by U.S. producers, but rather by somebody else's producers.
It's going to be the OPEC Plus guys. So,
all right.
So then the question becomes, and that's back to your point, how fast is demand growing? So again, the projection, sort of the official set, the most consensus opinion would be that between the middle part of this year and the end of this year, that we'll see demand growth grow about 1.7, 1.8 million barrels a day. And that's kind of the pace in 2022 that the forecasts are calling for, somewhere around about 1.7 million growth in demand every 6 months or so.
Okay, I'm no good at math
because
I went to public schools.
Yes.
But that tells me that by the end of next year, two lines are fixing to cross.
That's true. So if you think about middle of 2021, end of 2022, yeah, that's about 5 to 5.5 million barrels a day.
And how many barrels of excess production are they holding back?
About 6. So yes, exactly. Those are the two lines that are going to cross. We're going to see spare capacity just about disappear at the time because demand and supply, global production capacity will be about maxed out. So it's interesting right now, if you look at the futures market, that the price is in contango. The near-month prices are higher than long-term prices. And they're all about in that $55, $60 range for WTI. So, but the point that I think we would agree is that toward the end of next year, the market is going to feel like it's going to be a lot tighter, and that usually means a much higher price.
Well, what has happened in the past when those two lines get very close?
Right, how well, how fast might it go? That's an interesting thing. The market has gotten used to a $60 price, hasn't it, over the past several years? Prior to 2020, 2018, 2019, that period of time, it was U.S. oil production growing, and that was matching the growth in global oil demand largely, and prices were around $60. And now we see this OPEC plus production figure growing, and that's matching the demand growth, and so prices are around $60. So we don't have a lot of history about when it really, where's that extra barrel going to come from? But
I've got a big storage tank buried in my backyard. It used to be a swimming pool.
There you go.
So I've got mine. I got mine filled up and ready to go. But surely, John, Mr. Biden's big transition to electric vehicles.
Yes.
That's going to save us.
So see, that's the other bit of news coming from last week was the almost $2 trillion stimulus package that President Biden's proposed. And it's all about infrastructure, and there's a piece in there that's about building charging stations for electric vehicles.
Well, that's going to be the last barrier. I mean, as soon as we get charging stations, I'm getting a Tesla truck.
So here's an interesting point for you. So we have in the U.S. as a whole about 100,000 charging stations.
Okay. Of
that 100,000, about 40,000 are what they call publicly available. So you might be able to drive up and plug in, right? There's others that are, I presume, in residences and private businesses, things like that.
But we're not counting those.
Well, that's part of the 100,000.
Oh, so it's in a guy's garage.
Yeah, or whatever.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Parking lot someplace, maybe.
Right.
But of those 40,000 that are publicly available, only about 5,000 are what they call fast charging stations. So they can fill you back up in a hurry, 2 hours or so, less than that maybe.
For that 2 hour shopping
that's fast.
trip
Yeah, right.
I'm going to make. Okay.
So we have right now in the U.S. about 1.5 million electric vehicles on the road.
All right, I'm going to write that down.
Yeah.
1.5 million.
1.5 million. We have 100,000 charging stations.
Oh, that's
so there's 15
cars for every
charging station. Now I have no idea if that's going to be the kind of ratio that we see going forward, but that's where things stand today. So it's kind of a handy little number to keep in mind, because then you say, okay, we're going to, under the Biden plan, build 500,000 of these charging stations between now and 2030.
Wait, 500,000.
500,000.
So I got 100 now.
But I'm going to 500,000 more.
Oh, that's
right?
a lot
Okay,
more.
Right.
All right.
So if we keep that rule of thumb from 15 cars per charging station, right? Again, I don't know if that's going to be right, but that's what it is.
So now it's
7.5 million
EVs.
EVs, yes. So now, and we're 1.5 million EVs today.
6 million.
That's 6 million more that you would sell over the course of the next 9 years.
Well,
right?
If charging stations was the primary barrier,
bottleneck, yes.
Which maybe it's not.
Right. There's a lot of guesswork in all of this.
Yep.
But here's the other couple of things then. Last year, not a great year for car sales, but last year electric vehicles we sold about 300,000 electric vehicles in the U.S. It was 2% of the vehicle sales.
Coming along.
15 million total vehicles, passenger cars, that kind of trucks. 2% of them, 300,000, were electric vehicles. Right?
All right.
So now we think.
So they're not burning gas.
They're not burning gas, right? Yeah. So
I bet that's saving a boatload.
Well, so that's a number. So we have 1.5 million electric vehicles on the road today here in the U.S. We have 275 million. Passenger cars and trucks.
Yeah. How many?
So that's half of 1%, roughly speaking.
Of the fleet.
Yes.
Is electric vehicles.
Right. And so half of 1% of fuel demand is only about 36,000 barrels a day of oil or diesel, gasoline or diesel that's being saved by those 1.5 million cars, right? So it's not a huge number. It's not enough to bend the curve yet. But the question you might ask yourself
I'm asking it right now.
What does it take, right? 7.5 million cars in 2013. I say cars,
not
cars and
buying
trucks. Not buying gasoline or diesel, right? Okay. 7.5 million cars. Again, let's assume that the total population of cars in the U.S. stays static, 275 million, right? So now that's about 3% of the total car population in the U.S., total fleet, as it were. And that's equivalent to about 250,000 barrels of gasoline or diesel a day would be not needed.
Wait, 250,000 barrels not needed, converted over to something else like natural gas.
Yes, right.
Or solar. Right. Out of 100 million barrels of
that's
demand
global,
a day.
Right? Here in the U.S., we're consuming, again, round numbers, 20 million barrels a day.
Okay,
right?
So
250,000 out of 20 million.
Oh, that's one.
Yeah, it's
and
1.25%. Yeah. So it's not, again, we're talking, the question
not
is how do you bend the curve in terms of gasoline demand and so forth? And there's a lot to go in there. But here's another number for you before we leave this topic entirely.
We do, because we've got a big...
we've got a puzzler we got to talk to, right? So here's the other thing. So let's say every single one of those passenger cars and trucks, 275 million of them, went electric. Wave a wand.
Wave the magic wand.
It happens. So now you're saving whatever it is, 8 million barrels a day of gasoline demand, right? What happens to power? What happens to power demand in that circumstance? Well, again, based on what we think we know about charging and so forth, demand for power in the U.S. would rise about 20%. So we'd have to go from zero. We're like power consumption for electric vehicles right now is about 1/1000th of the power demand here in the U.S. We would go from that 1/1000th to about 20% if every vehicle went electric. So there's huge issues when it comes to reconfiguring the power supply to accommodate electric vehicles, and how fast that can happen in this world as opposed to another universe. I suppose
20% above existing power demand,
right? Yeah,
electricity demand.
Absolutely right.
California, you guys better get on it, because
California and Texas, right?
Well,
the two big states, right? For that.
That's right.
So
that's right.
But that again, that's part of the point. So we'll have to judge, and we have a lot to learn, because what about Amazon Prime, trucks driving around and things like that. And
look, what my response is?
That's a whole separate category.
I'm sticking with the oil and gas business. You and I are old anyway. We're not going to make it much longer. I think the oil and gas business. This tells me that if cars are the big threat to fuel the liquid hydrocarbons,
right,
then this is not around the corner.
It's that demand curve bends very slowly, is what it is, and it's not something that's going to be able to displace demand at the end of 2022 when the world sort of maxes out oil production. So we're going to have some interesting times ahead of us here on this, as best we can tell.
I'm thinking of buying another car that burns gas.
Well, that ties a couple of different items from the news together, but I know we have a long-standing tradition around here for a puzzler.
We do, and this one is nautical.
Which I hope means it has something to do with water.
It
or
does.
Just not. So I'm not.
It does.
Okay.
And by the way, we're going to be talking about a sailboat.
Yes.
So it does not, let's just say it runs on electricity when the sails aren't up. It does, so it doesn't matter. So we tie it to the other topic.
Okay.
But here you go. As you know, my dear brother, I love to sail, but I am a terrible sailor.
Yes and yes.
So I have a professional skipper who helps me not end up on a reef and not ram a battleship in the middle of the night.
Davy Jones Locker, yes.
So a year ago, my skipper, Igor, had his Lagoon 50 in the Caribbean, and he was down there during the pandemic. So Igor and I had a Zoom call to talk about where to put the boat next.
Yes. Okay.
So I suggested he could sail east back to his home base in Croatia.
Because he was in the Caribbean. Okay.
And he said, I have a better idea. Since I'm already in the Caribbean, I could sail east to the Pacific Ocean.
Oh.
And I told him, well, that would take too long, because that would take at least a half a year. And he said, nope, a couple days tops. And I said, you must mean that you'll sail west to the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
And he said, no, east. So I was about to cancel my navigation contract with Igor when he shared his screen, because we're on Zoom.
Yes.
And he showed me a map And upon close review of the map, I had to admit
Yes.
that once again he was correct. He had to sail east to get to the Pacific Ocean. And so here's today's puzzler.
Yes.
From his anchorage in the Caribbean,
Yes.
what route did Igor take to sail east to the Pacific Ocean? And if you think you know the answer, email us here at drilldownshow@gmail.com. And next week, we'll announce the winner selected at random from the thousands of right answers that I'm sure we'll receive.
Absolutely. And maybe the winner will get a vacation in the Southern Sea.
With Igor.
With Igor. Absolutely. Great. Well, I'm looking forward to the answers, and I'm looking forward to next week. Thanks so much for listening to this week's podcast. This has been The Drill Down. I'm John Spears.
And I'm Richard Spears.